There was a kind of cooking that didn't come from cookbooks. It came from necessity, from near-empty pantries, tired hands, and the deep, unspoken determination to put something warm on the table. This is about those meals. Pinto bean and salt pork stew before the week began. The beans were sorted. That was a ritual in itself. Sitting at the table on a Sunday evening, running dry pinto beans through your fingers, looking for any small stones that had been mixed in at the processing plant. Children were put to work doing this. It was quiet work, meditative work. And then the beans soaked overnight in a big pot of cold water. By Monday morning, that same pot was on the stove with a hunk of salt pork, just a small piece, barely larger than a man's fist, simmering low and slow. Salt pork was cheap, fatty, and full of flavor. It was sold at the general store by weight and kept for weeks without refrigeration. People used it the way a painter uses a base coat, not the main feature, but the thing that makes everything else come alive. The beans cooked for hours, softening into a thick, smoky broth that was halfway between a soup and a stew, depending on how much water had evaporated. Eaten with cornbread or just plain, straight from the bowl. This was a Monday meal in millions of American households for generations. Working-class families, sharecroppers, railroad workers, coal miners, they all knew this pot. Cornmeal mush, it seems almost too simple to mention, but that's exactly why it deserves to be here. Cornmeal mush was what you ate when there was almost nothing else. A handful of coarse cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water, nothing more than that. Cooked over low heat until it thickened into something substantial, something that sat in your stomach and made you feel like you'd actually eaten a meal. It was served in a bowl with a small pat of lard, or, if times were a little better, butter. Some families poured a thin stream of sorghum syrup over it. Some ate it savory with a pinch of pepper. The leftover mush from the morning was poured into a loaf pan and left to cool, and by the next day it had solidified enough to be sliced and fried in a hot cast-iron skillet. Fried mush, crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, was one of those things that people who grew up eating it never quite forgot. Cornmeal was cheap, shelf-stable, and could be bought in 25-pound sacks. For families living on almost nothing, it was the difference between eating and not eating. Vegetable and ham hock soup. Ham hocks were the parts of the pig that nobody much wanted, the knuckle, the rough skin, the cartilage. But they were full of collagen and deep, meaty flavor, and when you dropped one into a pot of water and let it simmer for 2 or 3 hours, something transformative happened. The water turned golden. It became rich and unctuous, a broth that could make almost anything taste like a proper meal. Into that broth went whatever the garden had yielded, or whatever the root cellar still held. Turnips, carrots, dried beans, cabbage, maybe a few wrinkled potatoes. Nothing was measured. Nothing was written down. The cook just knew by sight how much to add, how long to let it go, when to add the salt. This soup fed large families and it kept well. You could reheat it the next day and it was often better. Deeper in flavor, thicker, more satisfying. Families in the rural South knew this meal especially well, but versions of it existed. Everywhere people were poor and needed to make something from almost nothing. Oatmeal porridge with drippings breakfast was not always a luxury. On mornings when there was no money and no bread, oatmeal was what kept people going. Not the quick-cooking kind. The old-fashioned rolled oats that took 15 or 20 minutes on the stove, stirred slowly so they didn't stick and burn. The oatmeal itself was plain, but the addition that many families made, the thing that turned it from a wan, watery breakfast into something genuinely sustaining, was a spoonful of meat drippings, fat saved from frying bacon or rendering down a piece of pork. Just a small spoon of it stirred into the porridge, gave it a savory, filling quality that sweet oatmeal never quite matched. Children ate it without complaint because they were hungry, and adults ate it knowing it would carry them through a morning of hard physical labor. Salt was the only seasoning, and sometimes, if someone had thought to grow them, a few dried herbs. Crumbled over the top, it was spare, but it was warm and warmth mattered. Dried bean and tomato soup. The canned tomatoes. On the shelf, those were precious. put up in summer from the garden, usually sealed into mason jars that lined the basement shelves like small glowing lanterns. In the cold months, cracking open a jar of home-canned tomatoes and pouring them into a pot of cooked dried beans created something that felt almost extravagant compared to the plainness of the rest of the week's meals. The tomatoes added brightness and acidity to the thick, starchy bean broth. A little onion fried first in lard. Bay leaf if there was one. Salt and pepper, that was all it needed. The soup was thick and hearty, and bright red, and it smelled incredible when it was cooking, which mattered, because the smell of something good on the stove was its own kind of comfort. People who grew up eating this soup often say that no version they've made since has ever quite tasted the same, because the tomatoes they use now come from a can at a grocery store, not from a jar their mother put up in August while sweating over a boiling water bath in a summer kitchen. Chicken foot and vegetable broth. Chicken feet were not thrown away. Nothing was thrown away. When a chicken was butchered, every part of it found a use. The feet, scaled and cleaned, went into the pot with cold water, an onion, a few peppercorns, and whatever vegetable scraps were available. The collagen in those feet made a broth of extraordinary richness. Thick, gelatinous when it cooled, deeply nourishing in ways that people understood intuitively long before nutrition science had words for it. Families drank this broth from cups when they were sick. They used it to cook rice or dried noodles. They added vegetables and a bit of barley and called it a full meal. The feet themselves, if there was meat still clinging to them, were pulled apart and stirred back in. Nothing was wasted. The concept of waste was a luxury that most of these families simply couldn't afford. Lentil soup with onion lentils were the working-class legume, because they were even cheaper than dried beans, and they didn't require soaking. You could decide at 4 in the afternoon that you were making lentil soup for supper, and have it on the table by 6. That kind of practicality mattered enormously. Brown or green lentils simmered in water with a whole onion cut in half and placed cut side down, the onion caramelizing slightly against the bottom of the pot, lending a sweet, dark flavor to the broth. A little vinegar stirred in at the end. Salt and pepper. Sometimes a handful of dried pasta added in the last 15 minutes for bulk. This was Eastern European cooking, Mediterranean cooking, Appalachian cooking. It crossed every kind of border because poverty crosses every kind of border. And lentils are patient. They don't ask for much. They just slowly become something warm and nourishing, almost without any effort at all. Crackling and greens after the lard was rendered down. A long, aromatic process that involved slowly cooking pieces of pork fat until all the liquid fat had melted out of them. What was left in the bottom of the cast iron pot were cracklings. Small, crispy, golden brown bits of pork skin and rendered fat that were intensely savory and rich. These cracklings went into a pot of greens. Collard greens, mostly, or turnip greens, or mustard greens, whatever the garden or the market offered. Cooked for a long time in water with the cracklings and maybe a little vinegar, the greens softened into something silky and deeply flavored, the bitterness mellowing, the pork fat enriching every leaf. The liquid left in the pot after the greens were done was called pot liquor, and it was never, under any circumstances, thrown away. You sopped it up with cornbread, you drank it. It was considered medicinal. People said it put color back in your cheeks. Rice and gravy, this is a meal that doesn't get the respect it deserves. In the Deep South, especially Louisiana and Mississippi, rice and gravy was as basic as breathing. Long grain white rice cooked in a pot until each grain was tender and separate. And gravy, made from whatever drippings were in the pan after frying meat, or sometimes just from flour browned in lard, and thinned with water or milk. Dark roux gravy, the kind that took patience and a steady hand to make without burning. Poured over a mound of white rice, this was a complete meal. A cheap, filling, deeply satisfying meal. Children grew up eating it several times a week without complaint. Grandmothers made it by feel, never by recipe. The gravy was different every time depending on what had been cooked before it, and somehow it was always exactly right. Dried pea soup split peas, yellow or green, were sold in bags or boxes for almost nothing, and kept indefinitely on the shelf. Soaking them overnight helped, but some cooks didn't bother. They just rinsed them, dropped them in cold water with a ham bone or a smoked pig's tail, and set the pot on the back burner to go low and slow. Split pea soup is one of those dishes that transforms completely during cooking. The peas start out firm and individual, and by the end they've dissolved entirely, thickening the broth into something almost porridge-like, thick enough that a spoon can stand up in it. Deeply, unmistakably smoky from the pork, warming in a way that feels almost medicinal on cold days. Served with any bread that was available, this meal could feed 6 or 8 people from a pot that cost almost nothing to make, and it kept well reheated the next day with a little added water. It was just as good. Noodle and onion soup. Onions were always available. They stored well, they grew easily, and they were among the cheapest things. At any market, a family of onions hanging in the cellar could last through a whole winter, and they became the base of dozens of different meals. This soup was built on nothing but onions, water, salt, and whatever noodles were in the house. Egg noodles if someone had made them from scratch, which many households did, because flour and eggs were cheap, or dried pasta if the budget allowed for the store-bought kind. The onions were cooked low and slow in a little fat until they were soft and sweet and golden, almost caramelized, and then water was added and the noodles went in. No meat, no stock, just the sweetness of the cooked onions, the starch of the noodles, and the salt. It sounds impossibly plain, but everyone who grew up eating it will tell you it was comforting in a way that's hard to explain. Sometimes the simplest things are the most deeply remembered. Cornbread and milk soup. This one might raise eyebrows, but it was a completely ordinary supper in many rural households across the American South and Midwest well into the 20th century. You took a piece of cornbread, or what was left of it from the morning, crumbled it into a glass or a bowl and poured cold buttermilk over it. That was the meal, eaten with a spoon, cool and tangy, and filling in the way that grain and dairy combinations always are. Children ate it because they liked it. Adults ate it because there wasn't anything else. Some families did a version with hot, sweet milk instead of buttermilk, poured over the cornbread while it was still steaming. Others added a little salt and a bit of black pepper. Variations were as individual as the families themselves, but the core of it, bread and milk together, as a meal in a bowl, goes back centuries, long before the American South claimed it, all the way back to peasant kitchens in Europe, where people have always known that the simplest combinations can sustain a human body through a long, hard day. Cabbage and barley. Pot barley was one of the oldest grains humans ever cultivated, and it's one of the most filling things you can put in a pot. It swells as it cooks, absorbing liquid, and it thickens everything around it into something substantial and almost meaty in texture. Combined with a head of green cabbage shredded coarse, not fine, a couple of chopped onions, and whatever fat was available, barley and cabbage made a pot of something that defied the emptiness of the pantry around it. Cooked low and slow until the barley was tender and plump, and the cabbage had gone silky and sweet. This was the kind of meal that Eastern European and German immigrant families brought with them to America and held onto through every hard decade. It could be made with no meat at all and still taste like a full meal. With a smoked sausage or a piece of bacon added in, it became something almost festive. But even plain, it was enough. It was always enough. Milk and bread porridge, panade, before there were infant formulas, and before there was an understanding of infant nutrition. Many families fed their youngest children and their sick family members something called panade. It was bread, torn into pieces and simmered in milk over low heat until it completely broke down into a smooth, creamy porridge. For the rest of the family, it was a meal on nights when someone was sick or when the cold was particularly biting and something soft and warm was needed. A little sugar stirred in, a pinch of nutmeg if there was any. It was quiet food, restorative food. Families kept stale bread for this purpose because fresh bread cost more and went faster. The staling of bread was not a problem. It was an ingredient in its own right, one of the many ways that nothing was ever allowed to be wasted. Dried corn and bean succotash before succotash became a summer side dish made with fresh corn and lima beans. It was something older and more serious. A dish of dried corn and dried beans cooked together in a single pot, designed to make it through the winter. The dried corn, hominy sometimes, but more often just plain dried field corn, was soaked and cooked for hours alongside dried beans, sometimes with a small piece of pork, sometimes without. The result was thick, deeply starchy, intensely flavored. It had the quality of a dish that had been cooking for so long, it had become something entirely unified. Not corn and beans side by side, but something new, a single thing created from two cheap ingredients working together. Native American communities had been eating versions of this for centuries before European settlers arrived, and when those settlers needed to survive their first hard winters. In the New World, this was among the foods that helped them do it. Potato and onion fry, not a soup, not a stew, just potatoes and onions, cut thin and fried together in a cast-iron skillet with whatever fat was on hand. This was the meal that appeared when supper had not been planned, and the evening was already coming on. Potatoes from the bin, onions from the string hanging by the back door, lard or bacon drippings from the jar on the back of the stove. The potatoes went in first, cut into uneven slices because no one was measuring or trying to be neat, and then the onions went in on top, and everything fried together over medium heat, turned occasionally with a spatula, until the potatoes were soft inside and golden at the edges, and the onions were dark and sweet and slightly crisp where they'd touched the hot iron. Salt, pepper, that's all. Served in the skillet, brought directly to the table. This meal took maybe 20 minutes and cost almost nothing. Children ate it with milk. Adults ate it with whatever was around, and more often than not, the skillet was scraped completely clean. Tripe and vegetable stew. This one requires an honest conversation about what poverty cooking actually involved. Tripe, the stomach lining of cattle, was not considered a delicacy. It was an offal cut, the cheapest of the cheap, sold at the butcher for almost nothing because more prosperous customers didn't want it. But cooked long and slow, cleaned carefully and simmered for hours in a seasoned broth, tripe became tender and took on the flavors of everything around it. With onions, tomatoes, garlic, and whatever vegetables were on hand, tripe stew was a full meal. It had protein, it had substance, it had warmth. Families of Italian, Mexican, and Eastern European heritage brought their knowledge of offal cooking with them to America and kept it alive through every generation that had to watch its budget carefully. The fact that these cuts have now been rediscovered by fine dining restaurants as something exotic and sophisticated would have seemed very strange to the women who were cooking them out of pure necessity every week of their lives. Dried apple and grain porridge in autumn. Apples were peeled, sliced thin, and hung to dry, threaded on string and suspended near the stove or strung up in the attic where air could circulate. Dried apples kept for months and could be cooked back to life at any point through the winter, rehydrating in warm water or milk into something soft and fragrant and pleasantly sweet. Stirred into a pot of oatmeal or cracked wheat porridge, dried apples turned plain grain into something that felt generous, something that made a cold morning feel a little warmer. The natural sweetness of the apple reduced the need for added sugar, which was good because sugar was expensive and used sparingly. A dash of cinnamon if the family kept it. A little nutmeg. This was a breakfast that required almost nothing, just a handful of dried fruit, a handful of grain and thyme. But it had a quality of care to it. Someone had thought ahead, had done the work of drying those apples in October so that there would be something good to eat in January. That kind of foresight was its own form of love. Fried fatback and gravy. Fatback was exactly what the name said, the fat cut from the back of a pig. Hard, white, almost entirely fat with very little meat, it was one of the cheapest items at any butcher. Sliced thin and fried in a dry cast-iron skillet, it rendered down quickly, crisping at the edges while the fat melted out of it. The rendered fat left in the pan was used to make pan gravy. A spoonful of flour stirred into the hot fat, allowed to brown slightly, and then milk or water added gradually while stirring to prevent lumps. The result was a pale, rich, slightly smoky gravy that was poured over biscuits or cornbread, or just eaten from a bowl with bread for sopping. This was not a meal anyone ate for pleasure in the modern sense of the word. It was a meal eaten because it was filling, and it was what there was. But that doesn't mean it wasn't good. Fried fatback gravy over hot biscuits on a winter morning has a richness and a particular warmth that nothing more refined has ever quite replaced in the memory of those who grew up eating it. Making dumplings from scratch was one of those kitchen skills that required nothing but flour, fat, salt, and water, and the hands to work it together. No eggs necessary, though they were added when available. The dough was pinched into rough pieces and dropped directly into a simmering pot of broth or salted water. The dumplings rose to the surface as they cooked, puffing slightly, their surface going from pale and raw to something glossy and tender. Eaten in their cooking broth with salt and pepper, this was a meal that weighed almost nothing in terms of cost and everything in terms of comfort. In Appalachian cooking, this was done in chicken broth. The flat, slick dumplings that people in the mountains call slick dumplings or slippery dumplings. In Eastern European cooking, they were dropped into beef broth. In Chinese American communities, they were filled and folded. But the core knowledge was the same. Flour and water cooked in liquid feeds people. Head cheese was not cheese. It was a cold cut made from the meat of a pig's head. All of it, the cheeks, the tongue, the skin, simmered until the meat fell from the bone, then packed tightly into a form and allowed to cool and solidify in its own gelatin. Sliced cold and eaten on bread, it was protein-dense and filling and required no cooking at the table. Making head cheese was a community effort, usually done around hog-killing time in late autumn when a family or group of neighbors had slaughtered one or more pigs. The head, which otherwise had no practical use beyond broth, was turned into something that could feed people for days, a cold supper that required only bread and maybe a little mustard. The smell of it cooking, the steam rising from a pot of simmering pig head, was the smell of winter preparation, of a family putting food away for the cold months ahead. It was not a delicate smell, but people who grew up in those households knew it as the smell of security. This combination appears in one form or another in virtually every culture that ever existed under economic pressure. West African, Caribbean, Southern American, Latin American, East Asian. The reason is simple. Beans and rice together form a complete protein, something the people eating them may not have known in scientific terms but understood intuitively because it kept them healthy. A pot of long-cooked kidney beans or black beans over white rice. The beans seasoned simply with onion, garlic, and salt, with whatever fat or pork product was available stirred in. The rice cooked separately and served as a bed for the beans, absorbing the thick, dark bean liquid as it was ladled over. This was Monday in New Orleans. This was every day in parts of the Caribbean. It was supper in southern sharecropper households and in the homes of immigrant families in cities. It crossed every boundary of culture and geography because it worked. It fed people well for almost no money, and it tasted good. Skillet corn cake when there was no oven and no baking supplies beyond the basics. Corn cake was made in a skillet on top of the stove. Cornmeal, a little. Flour, salt, water, or soured milk, mixed into a batter just thick enough to hold its shape and poured into a greased cast iron skillet over medium heat. Covered with a lid, the bottom crisped while the top steamed into something tender. This was not quite cornbread and not quite a pancake. It was its own thing, thicker and more substantial, with a crispy brown crust on the bottom and a softer interior. Cut into wedges directly from the pan, it was eaten with beans or soup or greens or just with butter and salt. The beauty of it was its total dependability. A skillet. Corn cake didn't ask for an oven, didn't ask for precise measuring, didn't ask for special equipment. It asked for a Fire and a pan and a few cheap ingredients, and it gave back something warm and filling and genuinely satisfying. Souse. Meat souse was another one of those whole hog preparations that came from the deep tradition of using everything. Pig's feet and ears and snout simmered for hours in seasoned water with vinegar and hot pepper, until all the tough connective tissue had softened and the meat had fallen away from the bone. Everything was picked off, mixed together, and packed into a container with the cooking liquid, which set up firm and tangy as it chilled. Eaten cold, sliced, with bread and hot sauce or raw onion, souse was a complete protein source that could be made for very little money and kept for a week in a cool place. In African American cooking traditions across the South, souse was part of the New Year's tradition alongside black-eyed peas, a connection to older foodways that had survived through slavery and emancipation and every hard decade. Since the acidity of the vinegar gave souse its distinctive, sharp flavor, nothing else quite like it. And while it's largely disappeared from most American tables today, for the people who grew up eating it, it remains one of the most specific and irreplaceable flavor memories of their childhood. Stewed tomatoes and bread when the summer canning was done and the jars were lined up in the cellar. Tomatoes were the most abundant of all of them. And on the simplest suppers of winter, stewed tomatoes, simmered down in a pot with a little sugar and butter, thickened with torn pieces of stale bread, were what appeared on the table. The bread absorbed the tomato juice and softened into something between a pudding and a soup, thick and sweet-sour and deeply flavored. A little black pepper, a pinch of salt. The whole thing was warm and acidic and almost filling enough to feel like a real supper. Some families called this a main dish, others called it a side, but in lean times when the root cellar was low and the garden was months away from giving anything new, a deep bowl of stewed tomatoes and bread was supper, and it was eaten gratefully. Rendered lard and bread, there is a meal so simple that listing it here feels almost symbolic, but it was real, and millions of people survived on it. A heel of bread or a slice of whatever bread was in the house, spread with rendered lard and sprinkled with salt. That's it. That was the meal. Or sometimes just a bowl of lard on the table with bread to dip into it. Lard was fat and fat was energy, and energy was what tired bodies needed. Children were fed this for breakfast before school. Workers ate it before going into the fields. It was not good in any modern sense of the word good. It was sustaining in the most elemental way, calories, in a form that the body could use. And yet people look back on it with a kind of wistfulness. Because the bread was baked at home, and the lard came from the pig they'd raised themselves, and sitting at that table eating that simple thing meant you were home, and you were warm and you had made it through another day. Whole grain millet porridge millet is largely forgotten in the American kitchen today. For a long time it was a common grain kept in rural pantries because it was inexpensive, easy to grow, and stored well without attracting pests. Cooked in water or watered-down milk with salt, it swelled into a thick, slightly nutty-flavored porridge. Some families added a bit of molasses to millet porridge. Because molasses was cheaper than sugar and had more depth of flavor, others stirred in a little lard for richness. Others ate it plain. The texture was smoother than oatmeal, almost like a finer ground polenta, and it had a mildness that made it acceptable to even the pickiest children. In the South and in Appalachia, millet was sometimes considered poor food, something you ate when even cornmeal was out of reach. But poor food kept people alive, and keeping people alive was the entire point. Boiled turnips with fatback turnips were grown by almost everyone who had any land at all, because they grew quickly, stored beautifully through winter in a root cellar, and provided both the root and the greens. They were never considered glamorous. They were considered reliable. Cubed and boiled in a pot of water with a piece of fatback and an onion, turnips became something quite different from the sharp, slightly bitter raw vegetable they started as. They sweetened and softened, taking on the smoky character of the fatback, and the cooking liquid turned into a savory, slightly starchy pot broth that was drunk alongside, or used to cook cornbread dough. Turnips were what kept people alive in January and February, after the more desirable vegetables had been eaten. They were what was left, and people were grateful for them, genuinely grateful, the way you're grateful for anything that stands between you and an empty table. Milk toast. This is perhaps the most tender memory of all of them. Toast, just plain white bread, toasted in the oven or held over the fire, on a fork placed in a deep bowl and covered with hot milk, sweetened slightly with a little sugar, and sometimes a pinch of salt. Nothing else, nothing fancy. It was food for sick children, food for old people whose teeth had gone, food for anyone who needed something gentle and warm. And it was also just supper on nights when there was nothing else, and you had to make it feel like enough, and somehow the hot milk poured over the toast did make it feel like enough, like someone was taking care of you, even in hard times. The sound of milk warming in a pot. On the stove, the small hiss of it as it came just to the edge of a simmer. The pale steam rising. These are sounds and images that people carry into old age from their earliest childhoods. Memory works through the senses. And milk toast, of all the humble foods in this list, might be the one most deeply threaded through the memory of people who grew up in houses where love was shown through the small, quiet act of heating milk when the night was cold and someone needed comforting. The last pot. There was always a last pot, the pot that was scraped together on the last day before payday, or the last week of the month when the money had run out. Whatever was left in the pantry, a cup of dried beans, a handful of cornmeal, a tired onion, a piece of salt pork the size of a silver dollar, went into a single pot of water and was cooked until it became something. No name, no recipe, just the accumulated resourcefulness of people who had learned, over years and generations, that almost anything can be made into a meal if you apply enough heat and patience, and the kind of creativity that only necessity can teach. These meals were not lesser for their simplicity. They were not sad. They were the expression of a certain kind of human competence, the ability to look at very little and make it into enough, to gather a family around a table and say, "We are here, we are fed, we are together." That is what one pot and a fire could do. That is what it still can do. Outro. Slow, quiet, reflective. The kitchens where these meals were made are mostly gone now. The wood stoves have been replaced, the root cellars filled in, the cast iron pots passed down to whoever wanted them, or sold at estate sales to people who restore old iron as a hobby. But the knowledge isn't entirely gone. It lives in the recipes written on index cards in old women's handwriting. It lives in the memory of anyone who watched their grandmother cook from nothing. And it lives in the understanding that food was never just food. It was care. It was ingenuity. It was a family choosing, over and over again, to persist. The next time you find yourself in a kitchen with very little, remember this. Generations of people fed their families on less. They made it beautiful anyway. They made it warm anyway. And somehow, impossibly, they made it enough. Thanks for watching. If this reached something in you, or reminded you of something your own grandparents made, leave it in the comments. I'd love to hear it.